Then we're just gonna, okay, well, welcome everybody, and thank you for joining us at Harif for another lockdown lecture. I think we've done certainly over 60 of them since the beginning of the pandemic, and we have no plans to stop just yet. For those of you who are new to Harif, we are the UK Association of Jews from the Middle East and North Africa, and we are a group of 5 volunteers. So on behalf of myself, Lynn Julius, and Lawrence here, our technical expert, we are very excited to do this event on Lost Jewish Voices of Indonesia. Now, before we start, I just want to remind you of a few things. First of all, if you are not a subscriber to the Harif mailing list, please do subscribe at harif.org because you won't get login details for our Zooms otherwise. Also, do check out our sister website of Point of No Return, which keeps you up to date with the news. This session is being recorded, and it's also being live streamed on Facebook, and you'll be able to see the video recording on the Harif YouTube channel, which is also on the Harif website. If you have any questions, comments, or anything, please do write them in the chat at the bottom of your screen. So without further ado, we've had previous lectures on the Iraqi Jews who actually settled in India. We've also spoken about Iraqi Jews who settled in China. We've even talked about Jews who settled in Burma. Well, tonight we are going to take you on a journey of exploration to Java, Indonesia, where unbelievably there was a community of Iraqi Jews there. And who better to speak to us about this community than Deborah Cassrels, who knows the area very well. She's been a journalist for over 40 years. She was the Australian newspaper's first Bali-based foreign correspondent. She spent 8 years in Indonesia. She's also written for the Times of London, The Guardian, the Sydney Morning Herald, and The Age. She's published a book called Gods and Demons about her journalism in Indonesia. And she's planning another book on the Jews of Indonesia. So we're particularly grateful to Deborah tonight because she has prepared this presentation specially for us on the Iraqi and Sephardi Jews who settled in Indonesia. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to you, Deborah, and thank you for getting up so early this morning. I know it's barely 8 o'clock in the morning, Australian time, but this was the best we could do. So thank you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much, Lynn. And good morning from Sydney, Australia. And I'm really very, very happy to be here. And thank you for having me. I am exploring the largely unknown journeys and lives of Sephardi Iraqi Jews who wound up in the Dutch East Indies, which is now, of course, Indonesia, and in the early 1900s. Several factors triggered their exodus from Iraq: waves of persecution, riots and instability in Baghdad, and the desire for better prospects. They were also impelled to flee during World War I when their protector's status, or dhimmi as it was called, was revoked, and males were conscripted into the Turkish army, usually never to be seen again. inevitably, as people have come out of the woodwork to tell me their stories, my project has encompassed generational immigrant sagas scattered from Australia to the US, Israel, and Holland. It's been fascinating interviewing a lot of these people. Some of the family's descendants that I've interviewed for my proposed second book still ponder why and how their forebears went to Indonesia. It's a bit of a mystery. Roughly 600 Iraqi Jews are said to have settled in Surabaya in East Java in the 1900s, following the Asian trading routes, including the spice trade and sometimes the opium trade. They had arrived via word of mouth from relatives, who they'd found a safe haven and a very comfortable place to live. And that was, very appealing. So, and just as most Australian Iraqi Jews now live in the Sydney suburb of Bondi, close to the Sephardi synagogue and family and friends, so they formed this tight-knit community in Surabaya. In Bondi, they replicated that inclusive community. And there are about 2,000 Sephardi Jews in Sydney among 10,000 Australia-wide. Anyway, not all of these people settled in Surabaya. As an example, there was David Sassoon, an Iraqi Jew who was born in Burma. He worked for Dutch Shell as a chemical engineer, assaying oil across the colony. He married his Iraqi Jewish wife, Sybil, in 1940 in Surabaya through a matchmaker, as was customary back then. Much of the time they enjoyed this kind of whirlwind colonial lifestyle, courtesy of Shell. So they had servants, they hosted large parties, they had and functions, they attended fabulous clubs and events, and David was a violinist in his band. The couple had 6 children, each born on a separate island, and that was due to their father's transient job. Many of these people are now in Sydney, and I've been in touch with them. At the time, Sybil sort of lamented the absence of a Jewish community. I'm not sure if she knew about the one in Surabaya, but in fact, her life, was completely different because of her husband's job. And while she did lament the absence of this community, she did observe the high holidays, and even when she was later sent to the Japanese war camps. And the family immigrated to Australia in 1959. But okay, for a sense of perspective, this map shows the sprawling archipelago, including Sumatra, Sulawesi, and Java, where the Jews mainly lived, and some still do. Primarily, they settled in Java. Surabaya, though, which I think is quite clear on the map, isn't it? In East Java, it was a real sanctuary, and at its peak, over 1,000 Iraqi Jews lived there just after the Second World War. Now there are about 10 at the most. It's very hard to say exactly, but very few people there now. So today, the numbers of Indonesian Jews are estimated. Sorry, I just no, that's right. Today, the numbers of Indonesian Jews are estimated about 200, with another 200 Jewish expats.
It's sort of incongruous that Jews live in the world's most populous Muslim nation, and it's, you know, a nation of 277 million people, where Judaism is not one of the sanctioned religions. There's six sanctioned religions, and so most of those Jewish people now live in Jakarta, the capital, and Bali, the expats really, and Manado in North Sulawesi. And they pretty much practice their religion in secret, behind closed doors. It's quite dangerous. The true numbers are quite elusive, as many of them have converted to other religions, intermarried and assimilated, and significant numbers for protection against religious intolerance and extremism. And most classify themselves on national ID cards as under one of those official religions, the 6 religions. Anyway, this close-knit Baghdadi community in Surabaya came to my attention while I was working as a foreign correspondent in Indonesia up until fairly recently. I had reported on Dutch Indonesian Jewish descendants living in Manado on the tip of North Sulawesi, which is predominantly evangelical Christian. While there's a soft spot for Jews in Manado, where there's a synagogue and even now a Jewish revival, it is potentially dangerous for Jews outside the region, as I was saying. But in any case, in 2013, when I was up there, that community became the catalyst for my connection to the Sephardi Jews, which I knew nothing at the time. Until then, I mean. Their stories stretch from a colonial heyday, the brutal war years under the Japanese occupation, a subsequent bloody battle for independence against the Dutch, and their eventual migration mainly to Australia, the US, and Israel in the late 1940s and 50s. In the early 1900s, census data shows that more than 1,000 Dutch Jews lived across the archipelago, but a professor called Rotem Kauner, he's in the Department of Asian Studies at the University of Haifa, he reported the real size of the Jewish population probably exceeded 2,500 in the 1930s, which is quite a lot. The total grew substantially, of course, as European refugees fled Hitler. They worked as traders, merchants, and tea and coffee and plantation entrepreneurs. They'd originally come from the Netherlands, working for the Dutch East India Company in the 17th century. And most hid their Jewish identity due to Dutch discrimination. Iraqi Jews who had created trade networks across Asia then followed. The Iraqi Jewish diaspora to Indonesia largely flowed from Singapore, India, Myanmar, or Burma at the time, Hong Kong, and they're just uprooted because of conflict, persecution, and to seek better prospects. Most of the original generation, the witnesses, they're elderly and many have died. Some have lost their memories. And so it's, you know, important to preserve these stories their stories for posterity. But anyway, many of them who are still with us, they recall this golden era in exotic Surabaya, where they say it was an absolute paradise. In 1923, this flourishing community established their first synagogue around
which key celebrations and communal activities revolved. They were traditional Jews rather than Orthodox. And, it was difficult to meet kosher obligations without a full-time slaughterer, for instance, and generally a rabbi visited from Singapore to perform circumcisions and teach Torah. The synagogue was small, and in 1949, the congregation moved to a converted house bought with community donations to cater for expanded members. Neither synagogue had a rabbi, and services were led by members of the congregation. This was called the Bet Shalom Shul, and it was the only synagogue in the country until 2004, when a Dutch Christian couple donated one in Manado in North Sulawesi, which is still there. There should be a photo, perhaps, of the synagogue. Yeah. So, yes, it was. Anyway, despite settling in this improbable country, the Baghdadis blended into society pretty well. Surabaya in the 1900s, which is a major Indonesian port city, actually the second largest city in the place, in the nation. It was a tropical refuge where they could practice their faith with impunity under Dutch colonial rule and enjoy a relatively privileged, carefree lifestyle. Indonesia was socially less stratified than the British colonies, and the Jews enjoyed the same sort of privileges as the Dutch. They had membership in country clubs, free Dutch educations, and house servants and cooks, gardeners, and drivers. And those without British passports who'd come from those British colonies became Dutch subjects. They were multilingual. They spoke Arabic with the locals, and then they added Dutch, Bahasa Indonesia, and Javanese to their lexicon. So life was idyllic and generally prosperous. The Sephardis were resourceful. They worked as traders, fruit wholesalers, teachers, optometrists, and very much importers and exporters. My interviews with key members of the community are real insights into their changing fortunes and the alacrity with which they adapted in order to survive the tough times and ultimately preserve their Jewish identity and culture. I sort of feel that they lived through multiple lives, these people, because they had the war years, etc. But anyway, just as an example, description, there was this legendary family, the Masri family, and they were very wealthy. They welcomed the community into their grand home before and after World War II. And they celebrated bar mitzvahs, weddings, birthdays, Shabbat, the high holidays, everything. And also they had a mountain retreat where they used to take the community for horse riding and swimming, to enjoy the cool air away from the tropical heat. So they were very, very generous, and everybody, it was sort of a hub. People gathered there all the time. There were 13 children. This photo shows, actually, you can see there's a bar mitzvah, and it's attended by members of the Ashkenazi and Sephardic community at the Masri Surabaya home in the 1930s. The photo is courtesy of Eli Dweck, a Sephardi Jew who lived in Surabaya from 1949 at the age of 3 until 1958, when his family left for Israel during Indonesia's turbulent nationalist period. Yeah, the Masris, with their 13 children, they had a very key role in the synagogue. Charles Masri, one of the offspring, was this colourful, charismatic figure who controversially fought for Indonesia's independence against the Dutch after the war. And he was also friendly with Indonesia's founding President Sukarno, who led the country to independence in 1945. Charles was also the former president of the synagogue and the community until his mysterious death at age 52 in 1971. By all accounts, Charles was a kind and very generous man and who'd amassed considerable wealth. And yes, this is Charles's business certificate, and it shows he was pretty versatile with many fingers and many pies. But that's also his gravestone.
And why do you say he had a mysterious death, Deborah?
Nobody knows how he died. It's unsolved. It's within the community anyway. I've not been able to. I'm still trying to investigate it, and but however, among the community, it's commonly believed he was poisoned. That he died of food poisoning. There is no but this is what I have heard, and it was not an uncommon way to kill people, and you know it's life is quite cheap in Indonesia as well. So to this day, I have reported on very strange, murders as well. So, but we don't know what happened to him.
There is a member of the Masri family who's on the call,
yes.
Naya, and he says that Charles took ill at a function one evening and died the next day. He was previously healthy. So that points to sort of
potential foul play.
Yeah, potential foul play, perhaps.
Yes, yes,
yeah.
And Maya would agree that that it's extremely odd. There is something very fishy here, I think he would say. Yes, he. Anyway, so he's buried now in the Surabaya's cemetery, which you know, interestingly, still remains open to Jewish burials. Two of the couple's sons live in Jakarta, and their daughter is in the US. And Charles had, just out of interest, you know, he had married an Indonesian woman who'd converted to Judaism, and she is, I believe, died about 5 years ago. So yeah, I continue to look into it. However, Charles's brother, David Masri, who's now 94, he took over the president's role of the synagogue. And David is the only Iraqi Jew that I know of anyway, of his generation, still living in Indonesia. Though, you know, unfortunately, his memory has faded. So it's it's very, very sad that I was fortunate to have had, though, many conversations with him mainly about the synagogue. So the other, but just to let you know, the other 12 Masri children, they have extended family in Australia, the US, the UK, and elsewhere. Now, there should be a photo of David with Yaakov. Maybe. Anyway, that's a bit.
Not this one.
Well, that's the one. So that's the most recent. That's the most recent one, and that was taken about 2018, and that's Yaakov Baruch, who is who's a Dutch Jewish descendant and the default rabbi of Manado. So he learned about his background and decided and sort of went with gusto into Judaism, and now leads that synagogue up in Manado. The Surabaya synagogue, which was once the centerpiece of Sephardi life, has a checkered history, actually. So, and this is how I got to know David Masri, really. But in 2009, Islamic fundamentalists closed it while they were protesting against the war in the Gaza Strip. After that incident, the synagogue was heritage listed, but unfortunately it didn't save it. In 2013, it was demolished, and the land was allegedly sold by the Dutch Jewish caretaker for $4.5 million US.
Ooh, wow.
Yeah, and this guy, he argued actually in the Surabaya District Court that in 2011 that he was the only Jewish person left in Surabaya, and that made the use of a synagogue obsolete, and it entitled him to buy the land from the government. So kind of naturally. David Masri was outraged, and so was okay.
Please carry on, Deborah.
Oh, all right. Sorry. Did you get the David Abraham stuff?
Not completely. Can you just start again with the sale of the synagogue?
All right. So, yeah. Well, regarding the synagogue, he was an Iraqi Jewish lawyer. There he is in the striped shirt. That's him, and next to him, with his arm around, is David Masri. So that's the two of them together, and they were trying to get the land and the money back from and David Abraham, being a lawyer, challenged him in court. Unfortunately, that the court case failed. The caretaker won, I believe, over defamation. But in any case, unfortunately, David also died mysteriously in 2017. Basically, he went to sleep one night and never woke up. So everyone in the community was just very, very shocked. And also they feel that there was something not right about this. It wasn't a natural death at all. So it's still unsolved as well. Regarding the synagogue, outside of Surabaya, Jewish people knew a lot. Some Jewish people knew about there was a synagogue in Surabaya, but they assumed that because of Islamic fundamentalism. And so actually now there's a large hotel that stands on the site, which is very sad. So regarding these two deaths, as I said, I do continue to investigate them, that there's a bit of a cloud that hangs over the community about these deaths. No autopsies were carried out, and there's no evidence about what happened to them. David Abraham was one of 4 children, and his family had fled to Surabaya after persecution in 1914. His basically came from another type of dynastic Surabayan clan. His father, Edward Abraham, was one of 13 children as well, and he was born in 1934 in Surabaya, and his mother was born in Iraq. The 2 Davids were, of course, from different generations, and when the idyllic pre-war years came to an abrupt halt in 1942 with the Japanese occupation, David Masri and his family were thrown into Japanese internment camps with the rest of the Sephardi community. A year earlier, the number of Jews in the Dutch colony, as I think I said, had totaled about 3,000, they swelling as European refugees fled Hitler's persecution. So yes, these photos were taken, it's a little bit hard to say, but I would say about 2011. And that's Jacob Baruch again, and a Jewish friend, a descendant called Maureen. The Dutch, Australians and the Britons were the first to be interned in 1942 based on their citizenship. The Jews weren't incarcerated until 1943 because the Japanese didn't really perceive them as enemies. They didn't understand them. They didn't know where they fit in. They didn't seem to have any of the characteristics or whatever that they knew. But when the Gestapo sort of got to know about this, and they visited, and they put an end to that and demanded the Jews be, all of them, interned and separated from other prisoners. And the Nazis also mounted anti-Semitic campaigns, marshalling Indonesian support. You know, there was a very strong strain of nationalism, and so they played on that. As Elite Work, who I mentioned earlier, he noted the Iraqis in Java were the only Jews throughout the Japanese Empire who were interned on the basis of their race and religion. The horrors of the Holocaust of the Iraqi Jews interned in Japanese camps, and they've had little voice about their stories, about what happened. And, you know, their stories are of segregation, starvation, torture, disease, and forced labor, and they've barely been documented. My interviews with them and their descendants depict the struggle to survive the Japanese camps and their courage. Most of them miraculously did survive, though Edward, of this community that I know of, though Edward Abraham's father, he didn't, and all of them bear psychological scars from the deprivations and brutality which they attribute to early family deaths, ill health, and mental illnesses. Here, I thought I'd share some brief excerpts from my interviews about some of their war experiences. So, David Mustre, who I introduced previously, is now 94 and ailing. His story, told in his own words through a former Surabaya member, Sima Sassoon, is really compelling. A rambling colonial house of his youth as a Maharaja home where his family lived extravagantly. The day before being herded into a birthday, including a beautiful bicycle party going on, the party went on till 1 a.m. We were singing Dutch birthday songs that sounded like, "How long shall he live?" The partygoers were in fact singing, "Long shall she live," toasting the Dutch Queen Wilhelmina, whose birthday it was also. She'd fled to England from Holland. The general, of course, did not understand. We were pouring more drinks and we made the general join in the singing. We really had a great time. The next day, around 7 a.m., the phone was ringing and my sister went to receive it. But a Japanese soldier told her to put the phone down or he would pierce her with a bayonet. 2 trucks were outside with more soldiers and they raided our home. There was a big painting of Moses holding the commandments. They pierced it with their swords and broke all the Jewish ornaments, shouting, "Jews, you bastards." My father and 4 brothers were forced into the trucks, leaving us terrified. Months later, after the rest of the family had been imprisoned, the teen lay skeletal with amoebic dysentery on a putrid mattress in a camp, convinced it was his deathbed. David Mustre was 14, old enough to be separated from his mother, fending for himself in the Jewish block of a men's POW camp. And he says there was real hunger. People were hunting for stray dogs, even digging for worms and snails, anything that was edible. When his camp friend died, he cried inconsolably. I was so shocked and terrified. I cried my heart out. I hugged and kissed his cold hands. And I screamed, "Hans, you told me you would come out alive." That night, I was very scared. I feared I might be the next to die. His entire family survived the camps. David Abraham's father, Edward Abraham, who's now near 90, was born in Surabaya. Edward talked to me in a phone call from Los Angeles quite recently. And he told me this, and he says, I was 5 when we were forced to the camp, still young enough to stay with my mother in the women's camp. We slept on rows of wooden benches. Prisoners stole from each other. And when they were caught, they were beaten first by other prisoners, and then the Japanese beat all of us like animals. Many of us got sick. We were hungry all the time. We ate raw vegetables from the field, and worst of all, raw cassava. Soup came with earth attached to the roots of straggly vegetables and rice with worms, but we ate anything. We were so hungry. As a small boy, I saw people dying daily in the camps, especially the older Dutch people. The internees had to dig the graves. I lost my father, and my mother was very sick. As Jews, we did more work. We cleaned the barracks and the toilets. If any of the toilets were dirty, the Jews had to stand in the field and gaze at the sun until we fainted. The Japanese poked us with samurai swords to see if we were acting. The main punishment were beatings. They hit us with their rifles. They hit me when I didn't bow deeply enough to them. Bowing was a regular ritual. Edward now has a permanent limp from those beatings. During roll call one day, he recalls his pregnant mother vomiting. The Japanese camp commander slapped her and ordered her to stand and stare at the sun. The tropical climate was weaponized as a torture instrument, and she stood all day without food or water. Eventually, she fainted and collapsed. Nobody was allowed to assist her. Her children dared not help. To see if she was really unconscious, the commander kicked her with his boots. The cruelty made us think how much worse it must be in the men's camp. Indeed, Edward's father succumbed to a painful death after eating toxic raw cassava to alleviate his hunger. Solomon Elias is 93 years old and he's very frail. His father was born in Bombay, his mother in Iraq. The couple married in Singapore and lived in Surabaya. Solomon was one of their 11 children, and I interviewed him in Brisbane, Australia, a few months ago. When the family made the ocean passage from Indonesia to Brisbane in 1946, Solomon chose a 1936 atlas as his only worthwhile possession to take to his new foreign home. He had marked the POW camps in which he was imprisoned on a map of colonial Java, and most of the Surabaya Iraqi Jews were in the same camp. So this is from his atlas, and the first one is in I don't know if it's legible, but Batavia, which is now Jakarta. There was at the top, there's a deck camp in Batavia, and beside that is Tangerang. Camps were for women and children only. Going down to the middle of the map, you see first Bandung in West Java, which was a men's camp, I think. And then there's next to that is Cicalengka, and that was a West Java labor camp for boys and men. Horrendous camp. They were forced to work on a railway that was never completed. And Solomon described that as being utterly dehumanizing. One of Solomon's brothers was 2 years old at the time, and of course, constantly hungry. So his sister Hannah traded the family jewelry for food with the Indonesian guards. It was a common practice to barter in this way, but cruel punishments were delivered to those caught. On this occasion, a Japanese soldier did catch Hannah, and she was thrown into this rat-infested dungeon beneath a guardhouse for 2 weeks. The guard who had helped her was apparently shot. And Solomon told me the Japanese were the worst human beings on earth. They were so cruel. We were traumatized, but we never compared our situation to the Jews in Europe. Several Elias family members never recovered from the camps, spending years in psychiatric hospitals, and Hannah's ordeal has affected her for the rest of her life. And Sybil Sassoon, the wife of David, who I mentioned earlier, who worked for Shell Oil, she videotaped her Indonesia story before she died at the age of 87 in Sydney in 2007. Yes, that's her. And she was 35 here. And Sybil had moved from Singapore to Indonesia as a 1-year-old, where she later met David, her husband, and the couple settled in Indonesia while David worked for Shell Oil. That's their wedding. That was in, I believe it was in Surabaya in 1940. Yeah. Sybil was heavily pregnant with her second child when she was imprisoned at Wefstraat Jail in Surabaya. The entire community was sent there. And like everyone, she and her husband were jailed for 6 months separately until the camps were established. When she was due to have her baby, a Jewish doctor in the jail warned her not to go to the local hospital. Obviously, it was in some way dangerous. And she said in her words, she says, a Japanese soldier put a pistol to my forehead and said, if you don't go, we'll shoot you. All the women were crying. The baby was born without complications, and she says it was an easy birth, but soon after, a 3-day train journey without food or water ended at a POW camp in Semarang in central Java. And in addition to having this tiny baby, she also had her 2-year-old daughter and her mother with her. And she said, we were praying to God, we don't have food. At least there is some rain. We put our hands out of the windows to catch some water to drink. The guards were outside with pistols ready to shoot us because we were trying to get some water. When we arrived in Semarang, we found 2,000 Jewish women and children there. They'd escaped the Holocaust in Europe. They came thinking they'd be free. The Jewish people suffered because they put us in the lowest class of rooms. We had mud floors and planks to sleep on. We stayed there for 1.5 years. Like many of the Sephardi women in the camp, Sybil kept her faith. And she said, for Yom Kippur, we asked the Japs not to give us the day's rations of rice, corn, and vegetables, but to just give us some tea and bread at night to open our fast. The Japs were good enough to give us that after our fasting. There might be a photo of David in his band here. Maybe not. Yeah, so there's, well, actually it said he was a violinist, but he didn't look like, oh yes, there he is with the violin. So he regularly played in this band. He was the leader of the band, and yeah. So now that Benjamin David, who lives in Bondi, that's Benjamin at 22 years old in Surabaya, and that was 1938. Oh, sorry, he was born in 1938. And he lived there until the age of 22. He met and married his wife Sylvia in Australia, who was born in Singapore, and she's also of Iraqi Jewish heritage, and she'd emigrated at 19. As a boy of 4, Benjamin recalled being transferred by train with Dutch, Jewish, and British women to the Tangerang camp on Jakarta's outskirts. Benjamin, being so young, had stayed with his mother. And he said to me, we were all starving in the camp. Sometimes we collected banana skins to roast and eat. That was a treat. The hunger was horrendous. We were like skeletons. One day while I was playing, I saw some green beans on the ground, and I asked my mother if I should pick them up. She said yes, she would make soup. this Jap saw me and he chased me on a bicycle. I was scared. When he caught me, I had to show what was in my hand. He took me to my mum where she was trying to boil water on burning coals. The soldier told her to make the soup, but then he said, "You're to hold the pot of boiling water until it runs over your hands," and she did. There were a few women who smuggled food with the Indonesian guards. The women were caught by the Japanese. They shaved their heads and made them walk through the camp to humiliate them. The Indonesian guards were hung. I didn't see the hangings, but I saw them afterwards, hanging from a post. Within the camps, malnutrition, dysentery, cholera, beriberi, and mosquito-borne diseases were rife. Skin diseases aggravated by the tropical climate didn't heal. And mothers were racked by anguish because they couldn't feed their children. After liberation in 1945, the Jews returned to Surabaya to absolute turmoil. Their homes had been expropriated by the local Indonesians, and their possessions were all gone. So this period of violence and anarchy erupted across the archipelago during the struggle for independence. And the revolution played out particularly in late 1945 during the Battle of Surabaya, where politicized youth groups looted and killed at random. So these people, this community, they went from one bad situation to another. The Sephardi Jews, they all obviously feared for their lives. And Sima Sassoon, who's now 81, I interviewed her in a phone call, and she lives in LA. She'd been in the POW camps, and she compared the terror during this era of anarchy and military, when foreigners were beheaded and killed with bamboo spears, with the horror of the camps. She said it was just as tough. British and Indian Gurkha troops were sent to restore order and civilian government in Java. The Dutch assumed at that time that meant they returned to pre-war colonial administration and continued to claim sovereignty. But Indonesia won formal independence in 1949. The numbers of Iraqi Jews started to decrease at that time. But then in the early 50s, some Iraqi Jews who'd left that returned, and the Surabaya Jews entered this other golden era when community numbers peaked. The idyllic period, it didn't last long though, and in 1958, when Indonesia nationalized Dutch businesses, the Dutch were forced to return to Holland, and the Iraqi Jews who relied on them for infrastructure and essential services found that their opportunities for work and communal life dried up. And once again, they sought new, safe shores. And of course, around that time, the same time, Indonesian anti-Israel sentiment escalated over Israel's involvement in the Suez Canal crisis. So by 2014, there were less than 100 Iraqi Jews in Surabaya. And today, I think I've said that there's about 10 left, if that. So carrying Dutch and British passports, the Baghdadis chose to immigrate primarily to Australia, the US, or Israel. hundreds of Iraqi Jews arrived in Australia in the late 1940s and 50s, confronted by the restrictive white Australia policy, which often prevented non-Europeans from entering. And the authorities often determined that dark-skinned Sephardi Arabic Jews were ineligible unless they could prove otherwise. And that invariably meant displaying a lighter patch of unexposed skin or parading fair-skinned relatives at embassies. However, once they were in Australia, many of the Iraqi Jews, they had difficulty adjusting, and they found life quite isolating. It was suburban, but of course it was safe. At least it was safe. By 1969, the last vestiges of this vibrant Sephardi Jewish community had gone. Some had even lived through the 1965-66 anti-communist purges, when food was very scarce and the bloodshed basically turned rivers red. It was a shocking time. Java was particularly affected, and Seema Sassoon recalls that her mother hid the family, and the mother had bribed an Indonesian man for food and shelter during that period. They were absolutely petrified. Since my interviews with Iraqi Jewish families, I have received thanks from many who feel their relative stories have gone undocumented and unheard. One such note from the daughter of 93-year-old Solomon Elias perhaps sums up the sentiment. And she, Deborah Phillips, she says, "Thank you very much for your help in enabling these people's stories to be heard and recorded, and for the world to come to know what happened." My own Jewish background and decade based in Indonesia have helped to examine how the Sephardi Jews retain their religion, their culture, and the resilience in this frequently menacing foreign land. And I do think it's important to preserve all these stories for posterity. Thanks very much.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Deborah. That was absolutely fascinating, and is probably the first time that we've heard of the harrowing stories that certainly happened during World War II. And thank you for documenting these stories, and presumably you will have more in your book when it's published.
Well, yes, hopefully I'm powering on with it. and I'll keep you updated for sure. Yes. And thanks very much for everyone for coming and listening. It's been,
Right.
been great.
Well, thank you. And we do have a few comments and possibly questions in the chat. And we do have members of some of the families who lived in Indonesia. I recognize the Masri family. I think there are a couple of Masris there.
I've asked, picked on Maya Masri if he wants to say hello and wants to speak. Maya.
Oh, hi, everyone. Hi for this. It was a very informative talk. Thank you very much, Deborah. I really enjoyed it. We'd love the, sorry, excuse me. We'd love the link to the recording, if I may, because I could share it with a few people, and you never know, they might be able to come up with some, other references and information and pictures for you.
Yes,
Be
well,
great.
If we could get that, that'd be wonderful.
There will be a video uploaded to the Harif website, which is www.harif.org. If you give us a couple of days, then we will be able to upload this video. And
Lovely, thank you very much.
okay, no problem.
Right. Next
Yes,
person is David Jacobs still on the call? He has, again, family who are in Indonesia. David, do you want to unmute and start your video?
I did see a question.
No, he does actually say his grandmother was a Masri and she had an uncle in Indonesia. There might be a connection. I think he's disappeared though, or he's not.
Right. Okay.
I mean, let's see.
Right.
And of course, the name Masri means Egyptian, and obviously there are plenty of Masris around, not necessarily from Indonesia.
Yeah.
Okay. Daniel, do you want to start your video as well so he can see you?
Daniel bin Sefer.
Daniel?
Yes. It's
That's my
actually
sister Sylvia.
Sylvia Masri here.
It's actually Sylvia Masri. I'm on with Daniel.
Okay.
Fantastic.
Just to clarify, my uncle, my dad's brother, Charles Masri, at the time was the Austrian consul in Indonesia. He had no connection to Austria, but he was fluent in German and a few other languages. And he was a very prominent member in the Indonesian community, not just the Jewish community. So he got that position. He apparently was poisoned at a dinner. It was a big function, and died the next day. The family opted for him not to have an autopsy done because they believed, according to Jewish tradition, when you die, you need to be buried the next day, and they didn't want his body mutilated in any way or anything like that. And they buried him without an autopsy. You can ask me some other questions if you like, but I just wanted to clarify that particular point because I was old enough to understand what was happening at that stage. And I had just recently visited him before that happened. That same year, I made a trip to Indonesia and spent time with the family before I migrated to Australia. I was living in Singapore at the time.
Do you have any idea yourself of who might have poisoned him?
Jealousy in the Indonesian community. Maybe the fact that he was Jewish. He had a lot of assets in Indonesia. If I'm not mistaken, he had the agency for Chevrolet. I think that was the car. They were just jealous of him.
Okay.
Yes. Okay. Well, thank you very much. For
And
that
we knew
insight.
that. We knew that a long time ago. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think, can I say something?
Of course.
I think I forgot to say that, interestingly, he fought in the battle for independence with the Indonesians, which I found quite fascinating as well. And I think I forgot to say that. So he was, you know, hailed as a freedom fighter. You know, the Indonesians loved him.
Okay.
So
some did anyway.
yeah.
Oh,
That's right.
Amazing stories. And of course, they were the first ones to put the knife in him after they got independence.
Sorry?
But they were the first ones to try and put the knife in him after they got independence.
Yeah.
Oh God.
That's right.
Okay, we've got Ron Rabb, then David Jacobs. Ron?
Yeah, hi.
it's really a great pleasure to be here. Is Lynn on this call as well?
Yeah, yes, I'm here. Sorry, so
Lynn,
we're having to huddle together.
Yeah, we
problem
finally
with the
see
computer,
each
so
other.
we switched just to mine.
So
Nice
finally
to
see each other, Lynn, after 20 years of correspondence. Look, I've just come into this quite late. I was going to watch the video, but afterwards, but I thought, well, you know, I'll come in now. Just in case it was live, I didn't think it would be live like it is, which is great. Okay, so who am I? You know, who's this guy called Ron Raab with an European name like Raab? Well, my mother was born in Singapore. She was a Nathan, and her father lived in Indonesia. He came from Baghdad in about the 1880s, 1890s, and that's what drew me to this session. So all I know about him is that he was an importer and exporter, and his first stop after escaping Iraq, when there was, you know, the trouble there in that period, was Indonesia. And up until probably a week ago, up until, you know, recently, I thought he was probably the only connection I had with Indonesia. But going on what you've said here and the reading I've done is that there's 600 of them. So I'm just wondering with Deborah, I've come into it late, I know that, but you know, he was a Nathan, and he went there in the 1880s, but that's a long time ago. And then he went to Singapore and met my mother, and then they married. And of course, my grandfather was in Changi, and so was his son. You know, the whole story with all of that. After the war, my uncle, who went to Oxford University before the war and became a lawyer, went to Malaysia to and practiced as a lawyer there until he died in 1992. And I don't know if this stuff is interesting to you, but when he died, I got a phone call, and they were going to bury him in a Chinese cemetery in Malacca, in a place called Muar, M-U-A-R, in Malaysia. And I went and picked up his body and drove it to Singapore, where he's buried now next to Marshall, you know, the first Prime Minister of Singapore, who was a Jew, of course. So there's lots of stories there. I used to go over there all the time and see him. But anyway, the connection with the talk is that my grandfather was in Indonesia all those years ago, and so I guess I feel like all of you are my relatives, long lost relatives.
Well, thank
anyway,
you very
that's
much
a short
for
story.
sharing that, Ron. Is there anything you'd like to comment on, Deborah?
Well, I actually, for the fact that I knew I had that connection there, I did sort of build up my little file on Indonesia. I do a lot of international humanitarian work, and I was in touch with the Magen David Adom, which, as you probably know, some of you know, were quite active in Indonesia. I don't know if you know that, but there were Indonesian health people going from Indonesia to Israel fairly regularly for training.
That is interesting.
I don't know if you're aware of that. Are you aware of that? There's this is until recent times. And there were delegations from Israel to Indonesia, but they were all, of course, humanitarian. They weren't political. And the idea was hopefully to help take it up to formal relations.
Yeah. Sorry, Deborah. Sorry, Ron.
No.
Could I just ask Deborah if she has a comment?
Well, look, regarding that, Israel has no diplomatic ties with Indonesia, but tourism, and that's mainly pilgrims visiting Israel, that's a big thing. And there's also quite robust trade links through the Israel Indonesia Chamber of Commerce. So yeah, I think they like to keep it fairly quiet.
Yeah.
Can I share something from my experience? I worked for Standard Chartered for many years, and we had trading company, or more than one trading company, and all the tuna in Israel, a lot of it comes from Malaysia. There were lots of trade with Indonesia as well.
Yeah.
The Indonesians, Malaysians would sell it to a trading company in Singapore, and the Israelis would buy it from that trading company, and trade went vice versa. And Singapore was always full of Israelis dealing with both Malaysia and Indonesia.
So there,
Oh, yeah.
I think we'll
Well-
go over to David because I think he has to go soon. So
Yeah.
David, over to you. David Jacobs.
Thank you for that. Very, very briefly, I've got a meeting very soon. So my family are from Malaysia, of Iraqi descent. Where I see a connection is, I believe my grandmother was a Masri from Iraq. And from the stories we were told, my grandfather got the job as the Khazan in the Penang Jewish community because of somebody in Indonesia. Unfortunately, I was a little kid when these stories were told, so I don't have a lot of detail. But my brother who lives in Sydney, he is in his 70s now, so he would have a much better recollection. I've put my details in the chat if anybody wants to keep in touch. But I know that there was a connection with Indonesia between my grandparents and the community of Penang.
Yeah, that's fascinating.
And as a side note, our family now are on the board of trustees managing the cemetery in Penang. So it's still operational, not that we're expecting anybody else to go in there, but we're trying to protect it. And we're certainly looking at any help we can get because the family eventually will die. We need some organization to manage that cemetery. I'm just wondering if it's now I don't know if there's any existing cemeteries in Indonesia that are all Jewish, because I know Singapore sort of got amalgamated into a general cemetery, but Penang might be the last independent Jewish cemetery in Southeast Asia. I don't know.
I think the only Jewish cemetery is in Surabaya, but it's not a whole, it's only part of, and that's where Charles Masri is buried, and it's called I can't remember the name, but it's not a whole Jewish cemetery. No, as far as I know, that's the only one.
Okay, well, the oldest grave is 1835 in Penang, so it's pretty old.
Yeah.
Nobody buried. Yeah. So that's another story.
So,
Penang.
Yes.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, thank you
there
for
is
sharing
a website,
that.
PenangJewishCemetery.com, I think is the URL.
Right.
You're welcome. And I'd love to stay in touch with anyone who's interested. And I think I've got your contact. I've requested your contact details, Deborah.
Great.
So maybe
Yeah,
we'll have a conversation.
We'll send you a record of the chat anyway, Deborah.
And if you
brilliant.
send us your email, we'll send your details onto Deborah as well. You probably live next door in Sydney or something.
Yeah, it's been sent. You should have it.
That's great.
Thank you for an amazing presentation.
Oh, thank you. Thanks so much.
Yeah. And we apologize. We had a problem. Our network provider said there's an outage in our area and there was a reduced thing, so we couldn't do two machines. We've been doing one machine on limited.
So apologies, Deborah. You thought you might have trouble with your signal. In the end, it was out.
I thought it was my end.
Well,
any more?
It worked out.
We'll just have a last look at the chat, see if anyone else has any
Well, if
questions?
anyone else wants to speak, if you raise your hand electronically, I will see it raised and I can open it up to you.
I'll say goodbye. Be well, be safe, everyone. Take care.
Thank you, David. Thank you. All the best.
Thanks.
Bye.
Does anyone else want to speak, or does Lynn want to do all the thank yous?
I just say there was a question that I saw, but maybe the person went. They talked about the food and, you know, how did that, what did they have an influence with their food, the Jewish people? No, from what I understand, or what people have told me anyway, it was a fascinating mixture of
spicy Indonesian food, Dutch food, and Sephardic food. So they yeah, and they brought, I know a lot of them make this, you know, make the Indonesian food here in Australia, you know, the ones you know, the satays and the spicy food. So they carried all these different cultures with them.
Fascinating. It must have been lovely, actually. Lovely combination.
Right, we've got two more people who want to speak.
Yeah.
One, first of all, we'll have Lawrence Joffe, and then we'll have Ron Rabb again.
Okay.
Okay.
All right.
Okay.
Lawrence, hello.
Hi. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hello.
Yeah, and we can see you
Oh,
as
you can?
well.
Oh my God, that's a double mitzvah. That's wonderful. Thanks very much, Deborah, for your talk. It's really open, fascinating vistas. A friend of mine who's actually on the chat is researching for a project about Jews in Borneo. And together we've been looking into things. We noticed some Jews, I think from the earlier planters, from the Dutch period, mostly Sephardi. I think some were in Kalimantan, but I was wondering if you knew any more about this, or indeed if people from the Surabaya Iraqi community ended up in Borneo, even in Indonesia.
Well, I know that that Sybil and David Sassoon, you know, David, his job was with Shell Oil, and he was they actually ended up in Borneo for a couple of years. And I think they had quite a hairy time as well, because it was during the battle for independence, and there are all sorts of very tight situations that Sybil navigated. She was an amazing, sounds like an amazing woman, and she, you know, as I said, what gets me is these people have these multiple lives, you know, where they went from one disaster to another, in a sense, you know, but also they had these wonderful times as well. So you know, very varied life, and with, you know, just huge experiences. But yeah, Borneo, she talks about that. I just didn't have time to go into that for sure. There's I know that she escaped some nationalistic sort of disaster when they were all at some party in Kalimantan, and somebody noted that somebody had put a bomb under the house, and they all seemed to escape, but I mean, they did escape. So it and she and her big family sort of made it out on boats, and eventually, but it was because, yeah, her husband at the time she was sort of alone up there for some reason, and he was working, but and he came and went, and but yeah, that's yeah, another area that's pretty fascinating.
Thank you.
Oh gosh.
Okay.
Bombs and murders, and oh dear, all sorts of things, beheadings.
Ron, and then Holly.
Yeah.
Deborah, hi Deborah, it's Ron here.
Hi. Hi Ron.
Deborah, yeah. Deborah, look, some time ago I got and you may have talked about it already, but I got photos of, and I found it quite amazing, a new synagogue built in Indonesia in the 1990s. I've got photos of it. I just wonder if you're aware of that. I mean, you may have talked about it. Some Dutch guy, I think, put a whole lot of money into building or resurrecting a synagogue there. Are you aware of that?
I think it's the one in Manado.
Yeah, is that the one you referred to in your talk?
I believe it's that. It was donated by a couple of Dutch Christian, a Dutch Christian couple, and I've been there, I've seen it, and they also at that in that area, they have the largest menorah in the world.
Yeah.
And that's basically just below the Philippines, and it's on the tip of this. It's a good, you know, Sulawesi is this kind of really strange looking island. It's very yeah, there it is. So it's this sort of amoebic type of thing.
You're talking about
It
Manado.
has no,
Manado there.
yeah, that's
Sorry,
it. Yeah,
Sorry,
right.
actually,
That's it.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, so that's where I was up there. It's actually, the place is actually called North Minahassa, but it's just inland from Manado. And yeah, they have, and that's the Christian area, and they have a very beautiful synagogue there. And, you know, it's mainly Christian, but there are Muslims there as well. And I did ask if they were, you know, afraid that something might happen to that synagogue, but, you know, they just said, well, it's in the hands of Hashem.
I know you mentioned that nowadays the Jews in Surabaya are now mainly Christians, aren't they? Or I mean, can you elaborate a little bit about that?
Well, most of them have, generally speaking, have converted or assimilated, because they all have to put one of those official religions on their national ID cards, which they have to show for anything and everything. You know, Indonesians can't go anywhere without showing their ID cards, and the religion is very much part of it, and so they have to. I think at some point, David Masri said he was Buddhist, which is acceptable, but most people would say Christian or even Muslim, because it's just easy, and it just means nothing to them. I think David Abraham said he was Muslim on his ID card. It's just official, and apart from that, these days, though, as you say, there have been many intermarriages and conversions, and just people pretty much hide their Jewishness, unfortunately. But yeah, and there is a lot of extremism there, militant hardliners who are provoked very easily. So I can understand that. And when I was in Bali, I mean, there was a service every Friday night that I went to, and it was not more of a traditional type of service, but and a lot of Israelis would turn up who were fairly, I would say, secular actually, but it was more of a community get-together and lighting of the candles, but nice that it was there. And then there is also Chabad there in Bali. Yeah. But I wasn't that keen on that.
Okay. Holly would like to say something. Yeah.
Hi, Lynn. Hi, Lawrence.
Hi there. Nice
Good to see you. And Deborah, I want to thank you so much for your presentation. This is a subject that really none of us, I have never heard about this at all. That the Jewish people are in internment camps in Java. And so I thank you. I also want to say you thought you had a technological glitch in Britain and Australia. I thought it was on my end in the States. So there you go. It's all technology. I want to ask you, Deborah, were there any Jews that lived in Netherlands, New Guinea, because my 1960 globe that my parents bought me when I was 6 years old that I will not part with. We know it as Papua, but
Yeah,
when I look at
yeah.
it, it's Netherlands, New Guinea. Did you see if there were any Jewish people living in that island north of Australia?
Yeah, there are people who live in the what is the Spice Islands, the Moluccas, and or Flores, sort of east for sure. And yes, there are in Papua. Yeah,
Yeah.
West Papua, definitely. I've seen them, and it's quite extraordinary. Yeah, because I mean, I did meet. I met out of the blue one day a security guard in Bali who was obviously, I could see by his features, he was from the east, and he was wearing a Star of David around his neck, and I said I sort of went up to him and said, "Well, why are you wearing that?"
Yeah, dangerous there.
He said, and he looked sort of quite indignant and said, "I'm Yehudi." And he was quite, yeah. And I thought, oh, you know, and he was quite upset actually, you know, that I'd asked, in a sense, you know, it's like, you know, he was obviously, I don't know, I didn't really carry on. I was going into an office, and I just
Yeah, but it was, you were curious, why is he wearing a Star of David? I want to also ask, I want to ask also, Meyer, is it pronounced Missouri? How is he related to Charles and David Missouri?
Yeah, his father is Edward Musri, and he's one of the 13 brothers.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, so it's pretty interesting.
Yeah.
I was taking lots of notes while you were doing your presentation.
Yeah, so it was my luck to find him here.
Yeah, you were very lucky.
Yeah, he's been very good at
finding
inside information.
That's lovely. Well, I
conscious of time.
Yes, the hour is late because we're a little bit later than we usually are here in England. Yes. But of course, the day's just beginning for you in Australia. But I'd just like to conclude by thanking you again, Deborah, for a most wonderful presentation, and thank you for all the work you put into it. And obviously there is so much material there which, you know, should be better known. And, you know, we look forward to your book when it's published. And we wish you all the best with it. And
thanks so much, Lynn and Lawrence, and to Harif. I'm very delighted to have had the opportunity. Absolutely. It's been terrific. I'm very pleased to bring the you know, information to people that hasn't been aired.
Absolutely. And keep us up to date with